Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. When I was in elementary school, I was living with my dad. It was just me and him at home. Dad would make me breakfast at 6 a.m. every morning and then rush off to work. Most of the time, he would still be getting ready for work while he was eating. I would be left at home to get ready by myself and make my own way to school. One morning, I woke up with a terrible headache, so I figured that I wouldn't go to school that day. I didn't think it was a big deal to take a day off, because I needed to recover. I hadn't ever skipped school before, but since my dad was always home late, I didn't think that he would even realize that I had been at home all day, and I was looking forward to a relaxing day at home. I was wrong. My dad came home that day at around noon. I desperately tried to think of any kind of excuse as to why I was home. And my dad was really hot on education, and I knew that I was in for a scolding. I went downstairs to see him, and he looked at me and smiled and said, "Let's go for a walk." I was really shocked by this. I didn't give it a second thought, and I just agreed to go with him. I walked hand in hand with my father along a riverbank, and I should say that he wasn't the type to walk hand in hand with his daughter. But for some reason that day he did. I can't really remember what we were talking about that day, but I remember that I was smiling a lot. It was fun. I didn't think it was strange at that time. And after walking for a while, I felt that my dad's grip around my hand increased. I felt my little hand getting squeezed tighter and tighter. I looked up at him, and he was smiling. It was very unnerving. He then started pulling me along as he began to walk faster. Then, he started leading me down the riverbank towards the river's edge. I was a pretty tough and headstrong kid. I wasn't the type to cry, but that day I couldn't help it. My hand was hurting so much, it felt like my bones were about to break, and that wasn't the thing that made me cry though. I cried because of the way my dad smiled at me. It wasn't normal. It was horrible. It was unnatural. I really started screaming and crying loudly, and then my dad let go of my hand. I dropped down on the seat of my pants and kept right on crying, and I couldn't bring myself to look at my dad's face. After a few minutes, someone tapped me on the shoulder and started speaking to me. It was an old woman. I didn't know who she was, but she tried to calm me down, and she was kind and gentle. I couldn't stop crying though. My hand was throbbing, and when I looked up, I couldn't see my dad anywhere. With few options available to her, the old lady decided to take me to a nearby police box, and I thanked her for that. I didn't know where I was. I was completely lost. I hadn't ever been to that river with my dad before, and I didn't know my address correctly. All I could tell her and the officer was the name of the building that I lived in with my dad. So, we had to contact the landlord of my building. This happened a long time ago, and we didn't even have a house phone when we lived there. And once the landlord was contacted, he luckily knew where my dad worked from his tenancy documents, and then he called my dad's work. He didn't have anyone else to call, no mom on the scene, and I had no older siblings. My dad told the officers he would come and pick me up, and I started to get frightened again. When my dad arrived, I noticed something instantly. He was wearing the same clothes he left in the morning, and he always came home in his work clothes. This was not the man who tried to lead me down the riverbank. The man who did that was wearing a polo shirt and some jeans that I hadn't ever seen my dad wear before. My dad was really upset for me and worried about me, of course, but he was also furious that the landlord called his workplace. I don't know if his bosses gave him a hard time for leaving work early or something, But I quickly realized that this was my dad. I didn't need to wait to see him smile to realize that the real him was back. I really don't know what happened that day, how that guy looked so much like my dad and had access to our home. I know I was young, and I guess that you probably think that I could have made a mistake. But let me ask you this. How many times have you ever mistook your father or mother for someone else while they're holding your hand? You'd know it was them, right? I don't know what that was, but sometimes I wonder when I think about all the unsolved missing person cases out there, that something similar could have happened. And I would love to hear your theories.
It's 2016, around 4 a.m. in Shinjuku, Japan. I'm on a trip with my boys. Everyone is completely knocked out in the hotel room, except for myself. It was like the 5th day in, but for whatever reason, sleeping seemed like an impossible task this night. I was bored, yet wide awake. So I think to myself, I'm in the safest country ever. What can possibly go wrong if I step out for a bit? So I get ready and I head out. Also, the hotel is in the middle of the Kabukicho, the red light district. At this point, you might have a good indicator of where this is going. This was actually my first trip to Japan, so I had no idea of the reputation this district had. I'm walking around for a solid minute, just looking for something interesting. Suddenly, this man of Nigerian descent jumps into my field of vision. I bumped into one before on my first night when my friends and I were heading to the hotel. He recognized me apparently. He kept asking if I wanted a drink or insisted that I should go visit his bar. I tried shooing him off and told him that I was busy, but the guy wouldn't stop following me. After 20 long agonizing minutes of pestering, he then puts his arm over my shoulder like we were best buds and proceeds to ask me to go to his bar. Again, just one drink, he said. At this point I figured, why not? One drink wouldn't hurt me. Maybe this guy just really needs the business. I was looking for something to do anyway, and it's 4 a.m., so this was the best I was going to get. Regret and paranoia sank in the very second I walked into this bar. It was empty. Nobody there besides a Filipino waitress who was not in the best shape, probably in her late 40s, and was scantily clad. He asked me what I wanted to drink. My fight or flight response was on, and in that moment I couldn't figure out why. I instinctively avoid ordering an alcoholic beverage, and I order an oolong tea instead. It was 2,000 yen, roughly $20 USA. It was also part of the policy to buy the waitress a drink as well. That's another 2,000 yen. After serving me, the Nigerian guy leaves the bar for some reason. He says he'll be back. I calmed down a little bit and I started planning my exit before he returned. However, me being hella passive at the time, and too nice, I get stuck in a conversation with the waitress. She was actually a pretty cool person. I'm part Filipino, so we had something to relate with, and we ended up talking about the family we have in the Philippines. Anyway, things ended up being okay. I cut the conversation short and politely made my leave. I walked down the narrow steep staircase towards the open doorway that leads outside, and I found my Nigerian friend with a good 5-man group of his Nigerian friends. He didn't seem happy I was outside. His eyes widened. His anger and frustration was very subtle, but was still noticeable for me. I walked towards him, and he walked towards me as he's about to re-enter the bar. It seemed as if he was about to reprimand his employee for not keeping his guest entertained. I smile and wish him a good night. He waves goodbye half-heartedly. I feel a strong burning glare from his friends as I walk past them. I don't make any sort of eye contact, so I walk back and return back to my hotel room safely. But for some reason, I feel faint and dizzy, unusually so. I immediately started to suspect that it was from the drink I ordered at the bar. I was safe though, so I didn't make much note of it. In the morning, I tell my friend about the incident. He facepalms and tells me that I got really lucky and that it was really stupid of me to walk in there in the first place. Apparently, the type of bars that include the one I walked into belong to the Yakuza. The Yakuza are known to hire Nigerians to lure tourists to their bars because they're usually not afraid to be aggressive with the tourists. And also, according to reports, they spike drinks of lone tourists, extort money out of you or your belongings, force you to sign credit card bills as you're drugged out, and once they're done with you, they'll decide whether to beat you almost to death or not, and then dump you somewhere, bloodied and half naked. I assume this is to meet the weekly quota. I was very lucky to leave that bar at the time I did. The most terrifying part to this for me is that if I stayed in that bar, probably even just a minute longer, I would have lost so much. I could have even been horribly hurt, insanely in debt, or even worse. PSA, this should go without saying, but the Nigerians in Japan are cool. Plenty of the ones I got to know in Harajuku were really chill. Nigerians that moved to Japan, for the most part, are just trying their best to survive, like any migrant that settles into a foreign land. However, sometimes that need for survival leads people to malicious jobs, like the one in this encounter, for example. It's unfortunate, but hey, a few bad apples does not reflect the whole tree. So if you do visit Japan, just keep in mind and be aware of Kabukicho. Do not go into any bars there whatsoever. If you do run into someone that pesters you to go to their bar without any sign of stopping, a good tip I found now is to just yell, "Yamero, tasukete, keisatsu," and do this at the top of your lungs. Literally, it means, "Stop, help, police." Obviously a little extreme, but even a single word of the three gets the job done.
I grew up in the countryside, and when I say the countryside, I really mean the middle of nowhere. Honestly, there was literally nothing around. We had to drive through the woods and the mountains to go shopping. On the day this experience occurred on, it was dark. It was fall, and winter was fast approaching. My younger sister and I were in the car, and our mom was driving. We were heading to the drugstore and then the stationery store, and we did this often. I was really into origami and crafting at that time, and in the stationery store, they had this beautiful origami paper, and it was really cheap, so my plan was to spend all my pocket money on that. The drugstore was next to the supermarket, and my mom wanted to go in there. We parked in the parking lot. Mom and I got out, and I had to go to the drugstore with her, but when she said she wanted to go to the supermarket next, I couldn't stand it anymore. I ran off to the stationery store by myself. I got to the automatic doors and they didn't open. And then I noticed that there was a sign. It said that the store was temporarily closed. I was so annoyed, and knowing me at that age, I would have stomped my foot inside. I had little other choice but to go find my mom and my sister. I pleaded with my mom to take me to another stationery store, but my mom didn't say a word. She just started the car and pulled away really quickly. This wasn't like her. I sat back in my seat and I tried to think about what I said that could have annoyed her. It was so hard to concentrate on rational thought because my mom was driving faster and faster. I was scared and nervous, and my sister was as silent as my mother. It was really strange, and I stayed silent as my heart rate rose. We were still going fast, and we were approaching the crossroads ahead. The barriers were coming down, and my mom swerved into the opposite lane, and one of the barriers hit the roof of the car, and it made a thunderous sound. I was really scared now. No one was talking, and we were going faster and faster. I couldn't talk. I was young and terrified, and silent, salty tears rolled down to the corner of my open mouth. I couldn't understand what was happening. We made it across the tracks in the nick of time, and my mom suddenly made a U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction to our home. I was almost horizontal on the back seats with the power of the turn. and there was a car which had collided with a barrier and had skidded into the hard shoulder of the road. Another car had stopped behind it and might have rear-ended it. And in those split seconds, I think on some level, I could understand the reason for my mom driving like that. But I wouldn't find out the truth until later. I looked at her in admiration and saw that her face was a shade close to blue. She looked utterly terrified. It's a look that I have never seen before nor wish to see again. Despite all of this, my mom was still speeding down this countryside back roads. We went to a new and strange way home, but when we got there, my mom sat back in the driver's seat panting, and she looked exhausted. She looked at me, smiled, and said, "Sorry about all of that. I just feel really ill today. I think I have a stomach ache. I think I'm going to go to bed." Now, we never really spoke about what happened that day. I don't know why. I guess I kept waiting for her to say something, but she never did, and we all kind of acted like nothing happened. A couple of years go by, and by that point, I had completely forgotten about the incident, until one day, my sister told me the truth about what happened that day. Remember how I said that I wanted to go to the stationery store and I had to go to the drugstore first? This all happened in that short amount of time. My sister was in the car reading a book or a comic, and she said that she had the interior car light on to read. It was dark out by the time that we arrived. My sister didn't go into any of the stores that my mom and I went into that afternoon. I didn't even notice. She said she didn't notice at first, but a car pulled into the same parking lot and parked close to our car. She looked over, and there was a middle-aged guy in the driver's seat glaring at her. He was moving his head side to side, trying to look into our car. But after a few minutes, he pulled away. But then, he returned in his car on the opposite side to get a look at both left and right sides, I guess. My sister noticed it because, one time it's kind of weird, but 2 times, it's deliberate, right? Something was off about that guy. Mom returns to the car at this point, and my little sister sees the same guy walking behind her by a couple of paces, and he was clearly watching our family. And as soon as Mom is in the car, my sister starts talking about what just happened, so Mom readies the car as she sees me approaching. Perfect timing, right? My sister said that she and Mom saw the guy holding something in one of his hands in the parking lot, and my mom said it was a box cutter knife. So the reason that Mom was driving so crazy that day was because the man with a box cutter knife was following us. And I didn't know it at that time, but he was forcing her to speed up. Mom says that she didn't want the guy to know where we lived, so that is why she made a U-turn and went a different route. The guy seemed to be clearly interested in my younger sister in the car alone, so God knows what he planned. That coupled with the fact that he had a knife, so it was really chilling. But it's not the most chilling thought that stays with me. I often think about what might have happened if the stationery store wasn't closed. What kind of danger we would have been in if I stayed longer and we couldn't leave straight away. I can't imagine the emotional toil that night must have had on our mom, but thankfully, I know she is strong, and for that, I am grateful. And I am, of course, and we are all still here.
I have been mountain climbing for many years. I've actually met some strange and interesting people along the way. I usually like to climb during the summertime, and I usually use my paid vacation to climb. I love staying in the mountain lodges and cabins. I tend to rent one on average for about a week. That year, I decided to stay in a lodge for a few nights before climbing. The lodge was really nice, one of the nicest ones I'd ever stayed in. It was actually used in the past as a forestry classroom for young climbers. It was very big. That being said, the facilities were kind of outdated. It wasn't too bad though. I planned to leave early in the morning and return to the cabin, if all being well, by lunchtime. Fortunately for me, the weather was on my side and I ran into a group of about 10 climbers on the way. The group was led by 2 adults and 8 children. Since it was summer vacation time, it wasn't uncommon to see parties like this. There was something odd about this bunch though. They hardly seemed dressed for a hike or a climb. They looked as if they were heading out for an afternoon stroll in the suburbs. I mean, I was used to seeing school trips at the base, but never on the advanced routes. No disrespect to them, but the climbing route I was on was definitely for adults. The group didn't seem all that energetic either. I didn't expect them to be bouncing all over the place and super excited to be there, but I also didn't expect them to look so downtrodden and low energy. I saw this group as I was heading back to the lodge, and after seeing them, I wanted nothing more than to go back to the lodge away from them. I got back in, and I felt as if the lodge reminded me of how old it was. Those log cabin walls must have seen and heard some stories. Anyway, I could tell that this wasn't a popular rental either. It seemed as if it hadn't been inhabited for quite a while. It was clean, don't get me wrong, but you could just tell that nobody had been there in a long time. There was dust, not thick dust, but notable dust. Dust that seemed to state, "Welcome, it's been a while." Other than dust, dead bugs, fallen leaves, and sticks that had found their way in there. It could have been unused for months and I wouldn't have known. It was interesting. I was used to cleaner and more modern lodges, but I tried not to let it bother me. Well, it beats sleeping out in the elements, I told myself. So I went to take a look at the facilities next. All the cooking equipment looked in fine order. I decided to make an easy dinner and enjoy it by a roaring campsite fire. There's just something so relaxing about watching a fire, isn't there? The sun had already begun to set and a starry sky was now in full view. I really was enjoying myself. The next morning, I had plans to take in a little bit of fishing and I wanted to get there early, so I decided to grab an early night. I was in my sleeping bag by 8 p.m. I positioned myself on the second floor of the lodge by a big window so that I could watch the night sky as it was beautiful. I drifted off after a while and then I heard a noise. It sounded like the door opened. There was definitely a sound of someone entering the lodge. I looked at my alarm clock. It was just after 10 p.m. Who the hell comes into a lodge in the middle of a mountain range at this time of night? I strained my ears to listen and try and place the direction the noises were coming from. It sounded like someone was walking around. I did wonder if someone had simply just made a mistake and mistook my lodge for theirs. The more I heard footsteps pacing around down there, the more I realized that there probably wasn't a mistake. It felt like someone had intentionally entered the lodge. Now, I didn't hear any words or conversation, just the sound of footsteps and the occasional sound of doors opening and closing. It was really weird, and obviously frightening. I stayed still and listened. The footsteps sounded as if they had a squelchy quality to them, like they were wet or muddy. I listened closely and felt a bolt of ice pierce my heart when I realized that the footsteps, they kind of sounded like they were climbing the stairs. I also came to the realization that there wasn't just one pair of footsteps, but several. I broke into a cold sweat. I knew there shouldn't be anyone else in that area. It simply was impossible, but I could hear those squelching footsteps. I tried to pull myself together and thought that if there was someone out there in need, a lost climber or group of climbers perhaps, then I should call out to them and offer them the use of the cabin. I thought that would be the only logical reason why somebody could be here. The footsteps reached the second floor. What are you looking for? Somewhere to sleep? I couldn't hear any voices, but people were here moving around the cabin in silence. It was eerie. The footsteps drew closer still. They sounded like they were outside of the room I was in. Fight or flight time, I told myself. And with that thought in mind, I called out to the intruders to let them know of my presence. "Hey, Someone's in here. I reserved this hut, just letting you know." The footsteps stopped at once, and the cabin went silent. Then, after a few moments, the footsteps started again. They seemed to be still coming from outside my door. What the hell were they planning? I asked myself. I felt that there was some kind of sinister intentions behind their silence. "What the hell are you doing?" I called out in a more aggressive tone. No response, no movement. Now, I don't believe in ghosts or hauntings, but I felt that something that night wasn't right. A fear I can only describe as mysterious. This weird standoff went on for about 10 minutes. I was out of the sleeping bag and on my feet, ready for anything, and I had a weapon. There was still no movement out there, so I approached the door and I listened. I heard something. It sounded like somebody was whispering. It was so faint that I couldn't make out what they were saying. It seemed incomprehensible. It was really creepy. After a few moments, I heard that strange squelching sound again. It sounded like whatever was out there was leaving the door. I heard those wet footsteps descend the stairs. They left the lodge, and I heard the door open and close. I raced to the window, and it looked like the shadowy silhouette of a small person, or maybe a child, as they were walking away from the lodge. It was so dark that I couldn't say with absolute clarity, but I think that was what I saw. There was more than one of these silhouettes heading away from the lodge and down the mountain path. They seemed to disappear into the night sky. Well, let's just say I stayed up all that night. I wasn't going to close my eyes until I saw the morning light. I thought that these shadowy figures would be back if I fell asleep. I abandoned my plans to stay at the lodge for the rest of the week, and so I descended the mountain in the morning time without any issues. And let's just say that I'm very careful about the lodges I pick to stay in these days.
I was living in Japan at that time, and I went out to this club or bar one night. I meet another foreign girl there, and by the end of the night, we walked to my place together, as she had missed the last train and I ran an Airbnb with plenty of empty rooms. While we were both visibly Western women, she didn't speak any English, but we were both fluent in Japanese, so we chose Japanese as our lingua franca. As we got out of the bar and walked down the street at 3 a.m., there is this little scrawny-looking middle-aged Japanese man in a suit. He was walking in front of us, and we quickly catch up with him as he is looking over his shoulder every so often, getting notably slower. When we get close, he turns around asking us for directions to the train station, which is kind of strange for a Japanese to ask a gaijin, or a foreigner. But then again, it was 3 a.m. and not very crowded. We explained to him that the trains don't run after midnight, something a Japanese should know, and tell him from where to best hail a cab. He quickly manages to turn the conversation around from asking for directions to admiring our level of Japanese and how truly he just wanted to talk to us when he realized that we were foreigners speaking Japanese so fluently. We thank him and try to excuse ourselves several times as he desperately tries to keep the conversation going, which goes from randomly asking directions to "I was curious about your Japanese" to starting to become somewhat clear that he had actually been at the same bar as us and already noticed us there. As we pressure to part ways, he suddenly gets very obsessed about exchanging line. That's the Asian version of WhatsApp, which I tell him that I can't do as my phone battery is dead. Again, he stops us from leaving, saying he was at least going to drop us his business card. He then proceeds to get out a wallet full to the brim with trash and random paper slips, going through every single slip several times while getting more and more nervous as he cannot find a card. This process takes him several minutes, in which he begins stuttering, sweating, and getting more and more jitterish. As my company is tired and pushing to finally be on our way, He eventually pulls out a handwritten piece of paper instead, with a username on it that he says is his Skype name and to please contact him there, while again lamenting what a shame it was that we couldn't exchange line instead. I finally managed to assure him that I'd contact him, and after awkwardly saying goodbye, he actually starts running down the street and around the corner. I chalked it off as a weird encounter and I didn't really think much of it, until somewhere that same week, my friend invites me to meet her in a town more than an hour away from where I live. We meet with someone there who lives way out in the suburbs, where there is absolutely nothing, and really only residents frequent the area, if anyone at all. We stand at a bus stop to go into town, when somebody approaches us from behind with the words, "Excuse me, can I ask for directions?" I turned around and immediately recognized this scrawny middle-aged man with his nervy mannerisms. He seems or acts surprised, but remembers me. We get on the same bus and he sits with us. He immediately jumps on the chance to ask me for my line contacts again, stuttering, jittering, and sweating as per usual. And as soon as I give in and we exchange contacts, he jumps up and says it's his stop. He jumps out the bus and again starts running down the street and around a corner. Now this time around, I was a little bit nervous since the coincidence was extremely unbelievable. I knew he wasn't from around the area, and this far out in the suburbs was not a place tourists visited. Also, this was a completely different town where I didn't usually go, and it had been a couple of days after our first encounter. Meaning, if he had intentionally run into me there, he would have to know where I live in order to follow me out of town. After he now has my line, he proceeds to send me a wall of texts every other day, even when I hadn't answered, saying how I was the angel of giving directions, how he was incredibly lucky to meet me whenever he was lost, and how he was looking forward to seeing me again and trying desperately to arrange another meeting with me whenever he was back in town. The whole thing stopped as I eventually left the country a couple of weeks later, and after asking me twice when I would be back in Japan, Corona happened and the borders closed, so he finally stopped texting. I'm having a hard time to think of him as an actual stalker, as I just can't imagine this level of commitment from someone I have literally no connection with, other than running into him on the street at night. However, sometimes I do wonder. It was definitely a strange encounter, ranging into creepy due to his antsy behavior. Update: the borders in Japan have loosened their restrictions a little, and the stalker guy immediately texted me again to ask whether or not I am one of the foreigners that have been allowed back in. I thought I was through with him, but I guess not. And here are the top comments from my last video. And here's the riddle for this video. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.